Ana Maria Frankic, Director of the Green Harbors Project and also co-founder of the Biomimicry New England. I'm not writing a book about oysters yet, but we are doing a lot of oyster restoration on the Cape. Thank you.
Sandy McFarland. I was a conservation administrator and biologist for the town of Orleans for years, and I've been working peripherally with shellfish ever since because they are still my first love.
I'm Dot Leonard. I used to work for NOAA and then for Maryland DNR, and my first love is oysters. Motivates my life. Thank you.
And I'm Bill Taylor, Taylor Shellfish from the west coast of North America, and we have a family business farming shellfish. And I'll give a presentation tomorrow morning, and you can learn more then.
Betsy Peabody with Puget Sound Restoration Fund. So I work in Washington State within Puget Sound, working on Olympia oyster restoration, but also on the human engagement side of that particular endeavor.
Hi, I'm Barton Seaver. I'm a recovering chef, and we will begin the conversation. So I'm just going to ask a few questions. I was told I'm moderating this panel about 2 minutes ago. So we are going to, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, but then also open it up for just a larger conversation. And any questions that you have, just raise your hand, and I'll try and gauge how many questions there are, and we'll get to you. And I think this is really just sort of an open format conversation, and sort of setting the tone for the rest of the day and for the rest of the time here. So the first question, to Miss Betsy here, is what can we learn from oysters? I mean, what can they teach us about, what can we learn from oysters that we can apply to other systems?
Okay, since this is a meeting, a symposium of the World Oyster Society, and since Dr. Mori began this society by wanting to advance the knowledge of oysters, use oysters for the betterment of humankind, I'm just going to sort of talk within that context. And I think that oysters have some very important things to teach us from my perspective. And one of them is that oysters are, in my view, world building. I know that there are more technical expressions that are used, like ecosystem engineers and other things, but in layman's terms, to me, oysters are world building. They're building structures that benefit not just themselves, but lots of other organisms. And I think that we need to learn from that in the structures we build, in the human communities that we build. We need to build communities that are aligned with the right things, aligned with these resources, communities and structures that support many other forms of life, infinite forms of life. So it's sort of their world-building capacity that I'm really drawn to. I think the other thing that oysters do is they broadcast their larvae in the way that we need to broadcast ideas in myriad ways through various channels, again, in order to build a better way, in order to achieve the kind of sustainability that Barton was talking about in his remarks. And then I guess the last thing that I learned most recently from oysters is that oysters are sessile. I know that that's a statement of the obvious, and everybody knows that. You know, they settle in a place, they make a decision that's for life, and they settle in a place that supports them for life. And I'm a person who really has floated around in the water column for a good long time. And I didn't think I needed to settle in any particular place. But doing this work on oyster restoration, I have absolutely settled out in my place. And because I feel confident that this place supports me, that this place feeds me, that this place gives me everything I need. And I really learned that not just from oysters, but I also learned that from people like Bill Taylor. And in fact, it was during a conversation with Bill at a friend's retirement party at a bar that we were talking about this new place that I had gotten to, this feeling of really settled. And Bill, very flippantly almost, said, "Oh, you've become Cecil." Like that was the most natural thing in the world. He understood it instantly. And this whole journey of mine, working on oyster restoration, really began with knowledge and information that Bill and others like him in the industry shared generously with me. And I want to honor that today, since I really never have a world stage, okay? But today, I do. And I am, with this, inducting Bill Taylor into the Order of the Oli. This is made from an Olympia oyster shell cast. It's a silver cast of an Olympia oyster shell. I hope that you'll all admire this over the next few days. I'm guessing that the Order of the Oli could grow to millions. Who knows? Again, just broadcasting this idea out there for all the people who want to build this effort and build this community.
Well, thank you, Betsy. I'll follow on to what you were saying. One thing that, particularly in the last year or two, that I've learned about that I think oysters can teach us about is adaptability. And particularly as we venture into new methods of growing oysters, one of the things I've been surprised with personally is how oysters adapt to their environment and how they actually change to those situations, and it's actually making new ways to grow oysters that I didn't even realize would happen in the past. And so that adaptability is something I think that's also a life lesson that we can get from oysters, is that you can live with your environment, and even if it changes, you can still be an oyster, but you change your form to some degree. So,
is there more biomimicry that we can learn from this? Is there, what else? How else can we apply that aside from just new methods of growing oysters? What else can we learn on that front?
That's a long process of learning constantly from the oysters. And I will just give you a little tiny anecdote. I teach biomimicry as a biomimicry fellow, so learning not as a biologist about nature, but also learning from nature. And oysters, as a little kid coming from a little island in Croatia, we were surrounded with oysters. They were my favorite little rocks, that I called them in the beginning. So when I teach kindergarten and teach them about, little aquarium with oysters and what oysters actually contribute to our coastal systems and to the health of the coastal systems and the health of the human being, the next day the mother of one little kid called me and says, like, "Why did you tell my daughter to replace Brita with an oyster?" And I said, I didn't tell her to replace the Brita in a water filter, but that's a great example. The kid got it. So we definitely need to start thinking about what can we learn from oysters, how to be that resilient, how to improve the water conditions, and not only for themselves. Oysters don't just produce conditions conducive to life for themselves. They're not that selfish. They create it for millions of other species and organisms, and also for us. They are like in this amazing transect and connection between the ocean and the land. So in my experience with oysters and constantly learning from them, every little day spent on a harbor in Boston, in Wellfleet, in a Cape, they start calling me Oyster Whisperer because I'm constantly laying there and I don't know, talking to them in a certain way and learning from them, trying to understand how do they do that? What do they need from us to support their restoration and their life to be more more sustainable, as we were talking today. So yes.
Well, Sandy, maybe to you, because what do oysters need from us is a very interesting statement. And what do we expect from oysters? And how has that changed as our baselines have shifted and are actually still rapidly shifting as we speak?
Well, as I've been thinking about this for a while now, it has struck me that everything that we look at for marine resources is in the context of we want it all. And this has been going on for basically human history. And so I heard what you said about the community of the commons rather than the tragedy of the commons. But I look at what we have done thus far, and I still see it as a tragedy. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about whales of hundreds of years ago or fisheries of many 500 years ago and now to collapse now, to oysters, where 85% of the reefs are gone. So all of these things are happening which are shifting the baselines. When anybody starts to look at something, it's their first glimpse, and they think that that is what is normal. But we are asking a lot of oysters. We are asking them to provide the food that we want. We are asking them to provide the reefs that we need for stormwater mitigation, not stormwater, but storm surge mitigation. We're asking them to provide it for the different species, as Anna Marie was talking about. And now we're asking them to clean up the waters that we have fouled. So we're asking an awful lot of these critters. And yes, they can do a lot, but we need to help them out. We need to look at the sources that we are putting into the water of these pollutants before we get to them and expect them to do all of the work for us.
So in a way, like the recycling example that I used, we're potential to use oysters as a confirmation bias that sort of allow us to keep polluting, allowing the Mississippi River to continue to just flood, a dead zone. Is that
exactly?
Where does the political will come into? I mean, how do you formulate that argument, and who are the champions?
I think we've been struggling with that question for a long time, and I'm afraid I don't have the answer to it.
Every single person, not just we, us. That's why I think this is an amazing type of a symposium where we are bringing everyone directly and indirectly connected to the oyster, to the ocean, and to sustainable life. We all depend on each other, and this is something that learning from oysters and their collaboration efforts in an ocean system is something that we now need to learn from and start communicating, because oysters communicate. I'm telling you, there's something that we are now knowing in the science that the oysters that I just recently found in the Lower Mystic in Boston Harbor are communicating with other oysters, and they're starting to spread and trying to thrive in the systems that we are not polluting anymore. So we just have to help, and maybe this is an initiative to call everybody when you go back home to those 6 continents to start asking where your oysters come from and how can you also go to schools and culinary schools as well. My son is a chef as well. I never crossed my mind to go to the schools, but now this is it. We need to start spreading the word that this is a keystone species.
I want to talk a little bit about humankind and the people and the fishers that are involved with oysters. And I'm going to do that by talking about the Chesapeake Bay, because I know that the best. If you go way back in time to John Smith, who first came in the Chesapeake, you hear stories about oysters were so thick that they formed these reefs that were navigational hazards. And I think about the conflicts, because that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow. How have we resolved conflicts? Well, over the years, I mean, we've had an amazing history in the Chesapeake. Pirates. I mean, it was a stronghold of Blackbeard and a number of other pirates. And by the way, he was married 14 times. So. Such an ugly-looking man, but apparently. Anyway, he must have eaten a lot of oysters. But over time, I mean, what we've done is our love of oysters and wanting to consume them, we pretty much wiped them out. Between that and disease, we lost our oysters. And that whole ability to be pirates or to go out there and just harvest the commons has come to an end. So at this point in time, we're looking at that and we're saying, well, how can we, and we use the term restore the oysters, but it's a different world and we'll be doing it in a different manner. Some of it is called restoration, and in fact, there's this Harris Creek restoration that's been going on in the Chesapeake Bay, and there's a lot of controversy because the Corps of Engineers has spent $25 million on one creek. And the feeling is this is basically overwhelming. And I know that the industry, the waterman wild industry, if you want to call them, are really very upset about that. They think it's a lot of money spent foolishly. But let me go back to the piracy issue. A headline about a year ago in the newspaper said, Chesapeake Bay pirates return. And I thought, what in the world is that? Well, basically what had happened is these pirates, also known as watermen in this particular situation, went into Harris Creek and bootlegged a whole bunch of oysters out of there. And now the state has this very sophisticated surveillance system where they're trying to protect some of these restored areas. Well, what I'm getting to is I met with a guy recently that you all should talk to while you're here. His name is Johnny Shockley. Johnny comes from a waterman family. This is what they did for generations. This is what they knew. This is where they came from. Johnny has a mission because he would like to bring all these young watermen back into the fold, into maritime industries, by setting up every kind of an incentive program we can think of to get them going, whether it's an incubator or whether we're teaching marine trades in the high schools or how we go about it. But he's also doing it. He isn't just talking about it. He's got this company called Hooper's Island Oyster Aquaculture Company, where they're making equipment, they're trying to encourage other people to get into it, they're providing seed. They are big players in the future of oysters in Chesapeake Bay, and I think that's where it's at. I think we really have to get a whole family of people, not only consumers and those of us that love to restore, but also, most importantly, we've got to get the oyster farmers back in business again.
Well, I was going to ask, actually, thank you for talking about that, about the cultural shift. And,
Right.
you know, I grew up right in this area, and I witnessed a lot of this happening. And I'm good friends with the Croxtons, the Rappahannock River Oyster Boys, down out of Topping, Virginia. And I witnessed something rather shocking one time, which is, you know, they have their farm out there, and it's right off the point, and they're using diploids, and so they are breeding and they're spreading seed, and so they're actually repopulating reefs. And there was a reef that had been building over a period of 5 years, and I happened to be there the day that they opened it up for fishing, and they opened it up at 7 a.m. and by 10:30 it was gone. And what I don't understand necessarily is these wild oystermen are watching the Croxtons profit. They're watching it grow. They're watching this industry build. And then they, in 3.5 hours, you know, can destroy something and take from it. Rightfully, it was a legal fishery. It was open. I'm not faulting them for anything. How is the cultural conversion from waterman to water farmer, whatever the colloquial, you know, local term is going to be? What are the pressures there, and how do you think they're going to be solved?
Well, I think it isn't going to be solved for everyone. I mean, you've got some watermen who will never convert. I mean, they just, in their mind, you know, they're hunter-fisher people. They're not farmers. And it is a different mindset. But there are also watermen that are anxious to find another way to bring some income in. I mean, they're out there doing carpentry, they're doing all kinds of things that are not on the water. Once you've lived on the water, worked on the water, and are so closely associated with it, it's very hard to step away from it. And those watermen are being converted into farmers. So like I say, it's not 100%, Barton, but it's, you know, it's a step in the right direction.
Well, 25 million taken from the Harris Creek and buy them some bags and some seed might might be a good start. as
But-
well.
Yes.
I'd like to add that when a wild fishery gets so low that the fisherman can't make money, then they start to look at another way to be on the water rather than banging nails. And if they can do that, then they will. And so it's that kind of a transition that happens as well. Many of them just can't find work on the water, and so they go to land-based occupations. But in their heart, they really want to stay on the water. And, you know, a waterman is a waterman. That's what they want to do.
Can I just commend town of Wellfleet? Been so happy to work with them for almost 10 years. And they actually, the local community, the fishermen and aquaculturists in the shellfish industry decided to establish a no-take zones, sanctuaries for oysters, something that we all have to start thinking that actually in Massachusetts we don't have no-take zones. How can we actually support water quality and aquaculture industry if we are not having native habitats for oysters and shellfish?
One of the things we've learned is the sanctuaries are very controversial, and the watermen do not appreciate sanctuaries per se. But they are willing to accept reserves. And that means that you plant these areas and you let them grow long enough that they spawn several times. And in that way, you're increasing the population. Then you allow the industry to come in and harvest. It seems to work very well, not in all cases, but so far so good. That's an idea for Wellfleet.
It's also the number of years that you keep a place closed to harvest, because none of this happens overnight. And so, you know, several years of spawning might be enough. It may take more like 10 years of spawning before you get things going. So it's sort of a time frame also.
It's also compromise.
Well, Bill, if I could come to you. You've been enormously successful and an incredible example. And you know, we were talking earlier this morning, I looked at the shellfish map, all the sites that you have, and I said it, you know, pretty much mimics a fault line, sort of, you know, farm sites ranging all the way up into BC at this point. That involves an incredible amount of training and integration and attraction of new participants. How have you seen, how has that gone for you? What are the pitfalls in there, and how are you attracting younger people specifically?
Excuse me. You know, we've actually found it relatively easy to find laborers. That part has not been as difficult as you might find. But I think where we've really ran into issues is trying to find people to manage, and I think, whether we like it or not, the recession that happened in 2008 really brought out a lot of kids that couldn't find jobs, bright kids, and with college degrees. We were really struggling at finding people to have any interest. I think that, and also maybe a shift that you were speaking of, kind of this millennial generation coming along that are interested in where things come from. And so I think we're starting to see more younger folks coming along that have a real interest in actually getting out, getting their hands dirty, but also, you know, sitting down with the computer and having the knowledge that you need to manage a business. So I definitely see that as a positive trend in terms of people working. And then I think, you know, it gets back to a little bit the water getting in your blood. And I think people do, once they get those types of occupations and working outdoors and working with something that's growing, I think there is definitely a draw that people have, and something that they, once they get into it, they really like to continue in that industry. So, and then just keeping it exciting and trying to do new things. That's the great thing about the industry at this point in time, at least on the West Coast, is that markets are strong, and we're trying to find new ways to do kind of old things, I guess. But and so that, you know, having enthusiasm really helps to motivate your workforce.
I wanted to just pick up on something that Sandy said about sort of how much we're asking of the oysters. You know, we're asking for food, we're asking for filtration, we're asking oysters to build and maintain healthy ecosystems for us. And of course, we need to do our part. But I think that the asking actually implies that we're learning. Okay, we're gaining knowledge about what oysters do in the world and what oysters do for us. And I think that that's a really important learning and an important sort of step on our longer journey. And my experience in Puget Sound is that when you start to restore and rebuild a population in a particular place, and you can imagine people living on the shores and in the watershed around that place. That makes them look at that bay or harbor or inlet a little differently. It's a place now that hosts this living population that's doing all those things, and that presses them to maybe take a step in their own lives to do their part and reduce the sources of pollution that might be affecting that living population that's now being rebuilt. And I think having growers in an inlet, that does the same thing. You know, that's food that I'm getting from that water. Therefore, I'm motivated or should be motivated to try to reduce sources. Chefs do that when they're serving this wonderful food on the dinner plate. Again, a thing that comes from that place. It's giving us those reasons in many subliminal and non-subliminal ways that these are places that feed us. These are oysters that perform extraordinary acts on a daily basis. And yes, not only should we do our part, but we want to do our part to maintain these things.
So I've got a question for Sandy, and then I'd like to, last question to the group. What we're asking from oysters is worth something. So how do we as an industry work with municipalities to get paid for denitrification? How do we get paid for the services that we're providing, you know, ultimately? And because those are tax dollars not being spent. And so there is money somewhere, and how can that transfer to an industry?
It still requires money to do the restoration work. It still requires money to provide the oysters to do the work that we're asking them to do. So there is a cost involved in asking them to do what we want them to do. That's where some of the money is. It may be a little less than traditional methods, but there's still a cost involved.
Some of the best way of doing this is called nutrient trading. I think most people have heard about that, but what we're trying to do is to define exactly what the level of nutrient reduction is by the oysters so that there can be a tax credit for that, or there can be a bank, an exchange bank where you deposit nutrient credits and someone else can withdraw those nutrient credits. Some of the problems are, though, that not every oyster filters the same. And not only that, every creek, every bay, every area is a little bit different. So the oysters in it, therefore, are filtering at a different rate. So we've got big challenges. But if this really can come about, there's where the money comes.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're also non-point sources often, so it's hard to say whose cap you're trading.
That's right.
But I think, you know, Bill, if you could get Boeing to buy some carbon credits from you up there in Seattle.
That'd be great.
So last question, why aren't we talking about clams and mussels and scallops? Because they do a lot of the same thing. I think a lot of people in this room are growing them, or next to, in proximity, people that are growing to them. And how do those industries come together to create a unified message, because the messages are so similar?
You're the guy with all the shellfish.
Yeah, I will, yes, exactly. This is almost like a keystone species for the oyster, but oysters really don't live in that shoreline in intertidal area alone. It's a communication and collaboration that exists there between the salt marshes, shellfish beds, and there is some kind of stigma of competition that if you have certain species, they have to be alone, and we are learning, you know, through our practice to just monoculture constantly. And I like when you talked in your talk before that there is definitely a polyculture. We have to biomimic the nature, how nature actually, there is space for everybody. How can we create that type of establishment of shellfish aquaculture that we are not actually competing with each other, and establish some kind of caring capacities that will support different aquacultures and different shellfish communities. There is a great example at Mashpee and Mashpee-Wampanoag where the Native Americans and Native community really is teaching us also how to appreciate and restore systems that used to thrive here. So that's a great example.
Yeah, I'd like to add that once again, we're talking about restoring one species, as you mentioned. But what we're actually looking at in the larger picture is restoring the estuaries for what they once were, and that does include all these other species. So if we clean up the whole estuary and we have eelgrass coming back again, then perhaps scallops will set. If we have cleaner estuaries, then perhaps clams will be there, quahogs will be there, all of the things that were there when Native Americans were there and we weren't, of a whole balanced ecosystem. And that's what's missing right now, is that these systems are seriously out of whack. And it's our baseline right now of an out of whack system. And we need to look at it from a different point of view of a different baseline.
I wanted to ask Bill, because Taylor is one of the few companies that grow and market a lot of different shellfish species, and rather than just oysters or just clams. So how do you judge which species to grow, and what is the basis for it?
Well, to go back to Barton's original question, and then I'll answer Dot's, but I think just the iconic nature of the oyster over the other shellfish. I think if you're in maybe a different society, or maybe throughout the world, the oyster is more of the iconic shellfish, and so it's a good way to communicate to people. They've got a vision of what it is, whereas maybe clams and mussels don't have quite the same image in the public's mind. And I think, trying to find some way to advocate for the broader amount of species, I think oysters is a good way to do that. And back to Dot's question just about farming, there's a lot of different environments out there that different shellfish thrive in, and so it's really determining which one of the what environment you have that is on your farm that you can adapt to those different that species. What will they thrive in best? And I think one of the things I was going to mention before, and I think it's important, is that we, as shellfish farmers and people that are working in with shellfish, is that we advocate. We've got a species that can't speak for themselves, they're not the Bambi type of species. And I think it's really critical that we go out and speak about the needs of of those species that are out there, and the importance of them to the ecosystem. So I think our advocating for them is a very critical thing to their success.
Maybe we should get Disney to make a movie with the oyster as the main protagonist. What they did for clownfish.
Sammy.
And if you could do that for an oyster.
We have Sammy's back. He's available.
I'll talk to Pixar.
So I think, thank you very much. And I think we touched on all of the things that will be looked at in more depth as we go forward. But now I know I'm hungry, and I think we probably all are, so let's go have lunch.